What's good, y'all? Welcome back to the Onyx Report, Black Masculinist news for the day. Hope y'all are well. It has been a trip this last couple weeks. I am grateful to see that I still have an audience, and I can't tell y'all how much I appreciate the well wishes that I've gotten in the last few weeks. It's been an interesting ride, to say the least. Very interesting. Just to give you the very quick overview, I had probably about three things all really come together at the same time to make the last couple weeks a bit crazy. First, I taught a summer class, a 3-week intensive class, and that hit right after the semester ended. So I just had to roll right into that. And this is a class I hadn't taught before, so I was really, writing the syllabus as I was still starting. I mean, it was just all came at the same time. And then I got COVID, and that put me out for a little minute. I still taught the class because I know my students needed those units, but it was rough. It was a rough one. And then the last one is my air conditioner went out, and I live in Fresno. So if you don't know anything about Fresno, you're talking about desert temperatures. So when you live here, you got to have your HVAC game up because the winters can get down to, it's been down to the 20s in California, which I know is nothing compared to certain other places, but yeah, you can have some serious problems if you don't have heat. In the winter and the summers can get up to 110, 115 at times. So that said, the last couple of weeks, my AC went out right at the same time I was dealing with COVID and finishing the summer class. So I was a mess. And, my house is an oven, it was a mess. And I was worried about doing a show because my system would overheat real quick, with, my house being as hot as it was. So I just, everything kind of pointed to pulling out for a couple weeks and just kind of breathing. And I mean that literally, but it worked out and your boy is back. So I appreciate the patience. I appreciate the support. Shout out to I'm Listening. What's going on? Clutch and Stick. What's happening? Got Brother Ron, Brother Damon in the house, Brother Hayru, Brother Malika, D-Rock. What's up? Jeremy, Greg, Mike, brothers in here. Dr. Manhattan. What's up? Donnie. What's the word? Joshua Indigo. What's going on? Brother D, Mr. Blue Collar, and a number of others. Jay Cleveland, Roaring Sun. What's up? I really appreciate the support. Malika was good. Growth Talk Podcast. What's going on, man? I see you in there. I got to shout out my boys who were calling me on the regular to make sure I was good. And I really appreciate that. Because, some days when that phone ain't ringing at all, you be like, damn. But shout out to BGS. Shout out to brother, Brother Green Gorilla. Dr. Neil reached out to me when he got back from Africa. So, brothers was checking on me. I had a few brothers email me. I appreciate all of that support. Y'all don't know. I mean, there was a period of time where, you just laying in bed in a hot house. You can't go outside. You don't want to get nobody else sick. So I'm just, I was in my room for like a week with the door closed, watching movies that I just could not stand. I just couldn't go anywhere. But it is what it is. And I am back and grateful for it. What's up, Child of Light? Appreciate that. BGS in the house, So yeah, man, it was a rough one. But made it through. They just literally hooked up the AC like an hour ago. Like they were here from 7 a.m. and they finished up about an hour and a half ago. And I was like, all right, I told myself as soon as they finish that, I'm gonna jump right back on the air. I don't know how long it's gonna be, but I'm at least, greet y'all and thank you for the support. We're broadcasting today on innerlightradio.com. Shout out to the Innerlight family. Of course, YouTube. I'm not doing too many platforms today. Like I said, I'm really just kind of dipping my toe back in, trying to get it together. And there's been so much going on. It's ridiculous. Brother Rodney, what's going on? So, yeah, it's a lot to catch up on. And, there's one thing I wanted to kind of jump into that I got an article for a little while back. And I thought it deserved some attention. So let me see if I can. And then you get rusty even on all your own buttons. I'm like, man, I forgot where everything is in this piece. Let me make sure if I make some mistakes, hey, this is what it is. This is a piece that came out of the Guardian on June 25th, right? And it's called "An Unspoken Epidemic: Homicide Rate Increase for Black Women Rivals That of Black Men." Now, this is part of the issue that really, started to get on my nerves a bit while I was, healing, recuperating, the whole deal. And I'm seeing these examples, right, of, feminists, Black feminists in particular, who are using every platform they can to foreground Black women. I don't have a problem with that. Don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is the constant comparisons and sly little under the table attacks at Black men for their own self-aggrandizement, for their own advancement. And this is a political coup. I've said this before. This really is a political coup in many ways. And the only real problem I have with that is if you don't have a political coup that prioritizes Black women and girls, and go do it. But it doesn't need to be at the expense of Black men. And it doesn't need to be in competition with Black men. That's part of the issue that I have with this kind of stuff. So today we're going to talk a little bit about death. And we're going to look at some of the numbers. And I'm really doing this so that we have an opportunity to, kind of get some clarity. I'm going to leave you with some numbers. I'm going to leave you with some charts. Obviously, you can, stop the video, screen capture it if you're on your phone, your computer, you know what it is. Examine it closely because I want us to have perspective. And I want us to be able to speak intelligently about these issues as Black men, where we can advocate for the women and girls in our lives, but it doesn't need to be at our own expense. And this whole push for Black men to be silent, to fall on their swords and accept whatever is said about us, especially by the women we live with, it's absolutely ridiculous. So we're going to get to some of this mess and call some of this out. And y'all will have me as long as I got the energy to do this. And shout out to my boy Abuki. Shout out to, he reached out to me, gave me some insight as a nurse, which I really appreciated, because I was able to kind of check what I was given against his formidable knowledge about what's been going on this last couple of years. So shout out to that brother, man. I really appreciate that support, man. He reached out to me to see how I was doing, and it's a beautiful thing. So I appreciate the brothers in this space, the information, the support, and that's something you don't really hear about a lot. All the negative conversation about Black men, be it in the manosphere or in general. But one of the things I really got to say though is, I'm seeing brothers come together in a way I've never seen in my lifetime. And I can't tell y'all how excited I am at the possibility of that. I'm seeing brothers having conversation about everything from business to medical resources to, just, emotional support. And I'm loving it. And a lot of this is really being spurned on by brothers who are recognizing that nobody else is really coming for us. Not with a whole lot of positivity. Shout out to Hakeem, man. Appreciate that support. Y'all know the deal. Support the channel. Like, share, subscribe, join, and donate if you will. I got a couple of weeks to catch up on, so make sure you support your boy. PayPal, you know what it is. All the, super chats. Man, I'm forgetting all the all the main stuff, but support the channel, because at the end of the day, the only place you're gonna get these perspectives from are Black men on the ground doing this work. And most of us don't have any corporate backing and probably would turn it down if we did, at least if we're aware of what that actually does to the freedom of your voice. So that being said, I'm financed by y'all. And if we want to keep that discussion going, I need your support. Shout out to Charles Rich. He says, glad you're well. Dr. J, continued good health. Much appreciated, man. I am. And it's my son's birthday tomorrow. So he's turning 17. Boy, 17. And yeah, it's blowing me away. So we're at that point. I'm at that point. I'm hitting that crossroads. I'm about a year away from being an empty nester. There's a whole lot of stuff going on all at once. So anyway, shout out to Mr. Blue Collar. Appreciate that support. We all we got. Seems with everyone against us. Real talk. And it does feel that way. So looking at this article, right? It's entitled "An Unspoken Epidemic: Homicide Rate Increase for Black Women Rivals That of Black Men." And it was reminiscent of a piece I ran across a little bit earlier where they were talking about Brittany Griner and what's going on with her and Russia and whatnot. And, I hope she's able to get back to her family. I mean, real talk. But the unnecessary comparisons with black men I found problematic. And I keep hearing them left and right. Well, if she was such and such, if she was such and such, this wouldn't be happening. I'm like, I don't know where y'all get this from, but at the end of the day, black men have never been in a privileged position. And that's one of the low key kinds of assertions coming out with a lot of this black feminist rhetoric. It's a dig at black men. And the supposition is that somehow black men are privileged in some way that others aren't. And this is something that black feminists have to attack. And it's bullshit. Black men have never been privileged. And the strange thing is when you really push back against what they mean, aside from the Brittany Griner thing, like as far as that, they're talking about, well, if this was LeBron James that was kidnapped, okay, so somehow LeBron, represents some kind of black male privilege. But most of the time, when you hear these kinds of privilege assertions being invoked, it's really macabre, right? It's basically stuff like, well, when black men die, they get more attention than other folks. This is the logic that they use. What they really overlook a lot of the time is two things, at least. When black men die in a way that garners attention, it's either A, on video, or B, it's so egregious that it gets talked about. Whether you're talking about, and it doesn't even have to just be death. I mean, it could be death. It could also be a brother who spent 50 years in prison for something he didn't do, and it was finally revealed with DNA evidence that he didn't do it. And when they release him, you hear a little bit about it. Usually you get a short article and a blurb and it disappears. Right? It disappears. And at best, he wins a lawsuit. That's kind of it. But it's either something on camera or something that's so egregious that this man has lost his entire life behind a baseless accusation. And it takes those kind of extremes for black men to get one article and you may not even ever hear from them again. And this is what people are jealous of. And instead of actually advocating for their own position, they decide to attack the attention that black men get. And notice there's been no developed policy to stem any of the things that puts us in the news. There's no policy that's been extended, whether initiated by BLM or initiated by Congress. You ain't seen shit that's changed the actual conditions on the ground that produce the phenomena that you get to hear about in the news for the one day it may broadcast. And for some of the black men that you hear about, again, and I've said this for years, on average, when you're talking about police homicides of black men, you're talking about 200 to 300 per year. Usually that's against about 9 to 13 black women per year. And the reason we remember some of these brothers so much is because of how they died, not just because the numbers. Matter of fact, most people don't know how many black men died per year, right, at the hands of the police. And that's just the police. And those numbers are low because it's based on what the police report. So we get 200 to 300 and they're low. And that doesn't include vigilante violence, vigilante homicide, lynchings by law enforcement. See, those numbers are not included in that 200 to 300 either. But again, the one or two black men you may hear about in a year, or at least remember in a year, mainly it's because of how they died and how egregious it was. Forgive me, I still have a little bit of a cough, tickle in the back of my throat. Shout out to Jeremy Duncan. Appreciate the support. Also, shout out to Dardar. What's good, man? Appreciate the welcome back. Dr. Thunder, good to see you, man. Mr. Blue Collar, of course, in the house. But it is what it is. This is how we get remembered. And in the midst of being remembered for these macabre reasons, we get people that are jealous. The fact that some black men do get remembered for a brief moment because of the egregious shit that happens to them. And that has to be attacked. That's kind of what, I see happening. And the funny part about it is it's not just happening in social media. It's happening in news journalism or journalistic, reporting. It's also happening in the academy. And all of this is really because of the political coup I was talking about. This is we're seeing an unprecedented period in black women and girls advancing themselves and foregrounding themselves, starting businesses, for themselves, by themselves. They're doing a FUBU kind of move politically, entrepreneurially, all of that. And you know what? I ain't losing no sleep about it. That's whatever. Do your thing. But it doesn't have to be at the expense of black men. And that's the position I hold here. So I'll read through some of this and show you what I mean in a moment. So it starts out: 5 Black women and girls were killed each day in 2020, most of them with guns. Gender violence must be at the center of the gun debate, advocates say. Right? In 2020, a year of rising homicides amid a devastating pandemic in the US, the increase in the death rate for Black women rivaled that of Black men. So the basic argument here is that it's not that they're saying that more Black women are dying than Black men. They're saying that the numbers have rivaled, and the low-key under the table assertion is that there's a move to erase Black women, and Black men need to somehow be held accountable for this. Now, this is a Guardian article, so when Black men are running the Guardian, please let me know. But anyway, as homicides increased nearly 30% nationwide that year, the rate for Black women and girls rose 33%, a sharper increase than for every demographic except Black men, and more than double that of white women, according to a Guardian analysis of homicide data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Killings of Black women and girls increased across age groups, from school-age children to senior citizens. Gun violence drove the increase, with 3/4 of homicide victims who were Black women and girls dying from gunshot wounds. Well, and what we also know is tied to this is they're talking about the year 2020. So we saw these increases really across the board when it comes to intimate partner violence. People were locked at home, unable to leave. All right. I haven't actually spoken this much in 2 weeks, so my throat is no longer used to it. But anyway, so basically, right, they're talking about 2020, and it's not an accident that they're using 2020 specifically, because you're going to get the highest numbers you've seen in years. And pretty much any demographic numbers pretty much all of them have gone up in 2020. So it's not an accident that they're using it. Notice they're not using 2021, or they're not using 2019. They're specifically using the worst year for everybody to foreground women and girls. But again, not my problem, not upset about that. But the constant comparisons with Black men, it's problematic. So I'll continue here. Killings of Black women and girls increased across age groups. Okay, I read that part. The increase only worsened an unspoken epidemic that has been unfolding over years, advocates say. So what they're trying to do by saying that is they're saying 2020 was a banner year where so many women and girls were killed, and this speaks to an epidemic that's been going on. But we know that a lot of that had to do with the pandemic. Anyway, from the mainstream feminist movement to the news media to law enforcement to community violence prevention organizations, many institutions have stayed silent about the crisis of violence against Black women, who are expected to care for others, but often do not receive the same level of care. And this is an ongoing trope too, right? This is a continuing agenda against Black women that is initiated by everybody, including Black men. This is the narrative you hear regularly. D-Rock, appreciate that support. He says, believe it, Black women is way out of order. It's been crazy, man. I've just been sitting in the cut this last couple of weeks just watching some of this, and it's been ridiculous. So here's a chart I want to share with you. It gets to the heart of what they're talking about. So Black women and girls had the second highest homicide rate increase of 2019 to 2020. So they're not only saying 2020 was bad, but they're saying that the rate of increase from the year before the pandemic to the year of the pandemic was such a great increase. In other words, what you have happening here is people are cherry picking numbers to suit an agenda. And the agenda is, as I said, foregrounding women and girls, because this is a political coup. This is a moment where they're trying to seize as much attention as possible and advance themselves as a demographic. And this is unprecedented in the Black community, because Black men in many ways are still operating with a very communal framework, right? If you look at the recent reports on Ice Cube's work, the agenda for Black America that he was pushing during Trump's presidency, where everybody was coming down on him, he's actually made some groundwork. He's actually made up some ground, right? He's gotten some support. He's starting to get some resources. He's starting to get jobs, all under the name of the work he's been doing the last few years. And he's even outlined, due to complaints that he's gotten, right, what benefits Black women should get, Black women entrepreneurs most particularly, mainly because of the complaints Black women had that he didn't sideline, any material interest just for women and girls. But he didn't sideline or highlight any particular interest for black men either. He was approaching it as a communal gesture in the first place. He was attacked by feminists that argued that he didn't foreground women enough. He challenged them to help him develop his program further. And now, as he's starting to gain some traction, he has areas marked out just for women in his platform. But again, before and after the complaints, Cube was working as many black men do, at least conceptually, working from a communal framework where they're looking at the black community as a unit. But a lot of the time, when you hear from these feminists, they're not talking about the black community as a unit. They're talking about themselves. They're talking about black women and girls, maybe LGBTQ. And a lot of that, as I've said before, is because LGBT, generally, culturally speaking, leans feminine, leans in women's advantage. So the union between the two becomes a political gesture, mainly because it, you know, um, really pedestalizes black women in a particular way. Shout out to D Rock. Appreciate that support. Right. So, that being said, you're dealing with a communal outlook from black men and a very demographic specific outlook for many of these politicized black feminists. And that culture has been advancing and growing, even from those that don't even know really what a feminist is, but they're participating in that culture, right? That for us, by us culture for just black women and girls and LGBT. And that's what this particular article does. So they're finding any moment, any area they can, numerically to foreground women. And again, it's constantly at the expense of black males. So in this particular graph you're looking at, black women and girls had the second highest homicide rate increase of 2019 from 2019 to 2020. And so what they show you is that in terms of female homicides per 100,000 in 2020, black women had the highest number out of women with an 8.0, right? So 8 .0 homicides per 100,000 in 2020. The second highest is American Indian / Alaska Natives at 5.8. White women had 2.0. Hispanic had 2.1. So black women clearly had the highest numbers out of women, right, with 8.0. And what they're saying is the change from 2019 to 2020 is a 33% increase. But when you look at black men, right, same scale, homicides per 100,000 in 2020, black men died at a rate numbers of 57.3. So black women died at 8.0 per 100,000. Black men 57.3 per 100,000. The second highest numbers were again American Indian / Alaska Native men at 23.5. Black men died at 57.3, and they had a 34% increase from 2019 to 2020. Right? But notice the title of the article. The title of the article isn't about black men who've died to the highest degree and had the highest rate increase from 2019 to 2020. The title of the article is about black women because they had the second highest. Now I'm going to continue in the article, but I want to show you this is very reminiscent of one that I read to you guys last year. And this was one dealing with COVID, right? This was a piece on Black Enterprise. And they ran it on a number of different platforms. They were talking about who was dying at the highest rates. And the article title was Black Women Are Dying of COVID at Higher Rates Than Men in Other Racial Ethnic Groups. Now, this is a very carefully worded title. Black women are dying of COVID at higher rates than men in other racial ethnic groups. And what you had to do is when you scroll down, now this was actually a piece that came out of a paper in the Journal of General Internal Medicine published by the Gender Sci Lab at Harvard University, right? Gender Sci Lab at Harvard University. And when you go down to the bottom of the article, you got to get to the second bullet point to find out that black men have far higher mortality rates than any other sex and racial group, including over 6 times higher than the rate among white men. What's the first bullet point? First bullet point says black women have COVID-19 mortality rates that are almost 4 times higher than that of white men and 3 times higher than that of Asian men. So that's the headline. That's the bullet point. So that's in the title and it's the head bullet point here. But when you get to the second bullet point, you find that black men actually died more. Notice a trend, right? We go back to our article here on The Guardian. The focal point is black women and girls. But when you get down to the chart that breaks down the most relevant information, the core, the heartbeat of the article, you would think if the numbers are this egregious that the article would at least be about black men. And here's the other thing. Even though you'll see black men when we die in an egregious manner or something of that nature, you may see an article about it. Usually you see a video about it. That's usually what you see, right? But the thing about it is, I don't see too many articles pointing this out. I don't see it. Even though it's going back to 2020 as if there's nothing to talk about since then. Even then, black men are dying egregiously, and I don't see any articles about this. The article is about black women, and black men are kind of buried, but our names come up conveniently when it can garner attention, and that's one of the things we've noticed. Shout out to Jay Jermaine, appreciate that support. Or Jermaine, yeah, I did say that right. So, but that's one of the things I noticed, right? Whether it's because we've died or because our numbers are useful, we're drawn out like a horse and pony show when it's convenient. This is what I've been calling flat blackness. And I've said this several times. There are different ways to interpret flat blackness. The concept itself, when I first heard it, had more to do with lineage. It had to do with ADOS. It had to do with, those kind of things. But when I talk about flat blackness, I'm talking about the ways that black men's numbers are used to advance and foreground black women and girls when it comes to articles like this, when it comes to academic work like this. And it tends to be at the expense of black men. But our numbers are useful for getting attention. And then there's a bait and switch that happens not long after the article starts or the film or the documentary. And all of a sudden, black men are erased. And when you do see a bullet point, when they mention men to get attention and they show you the numbers, if they're honest enough to do so, what you find is the situation is usually far worse for black men. And you're just supposed to see it and forget about it and move on to the next point. So basically what they're saying is, yes, black men have died 57.3 out of per 100,000, but black women have died at 8.0. And they're nearly close to as much of an increase in deaths from 2019 to 2020 as black men. So we need to talk more about black women and girls. And it's like, so let me be clear. All I'm saying is if you want to write these kind of articles, then write them. But leave black men out of it. If the only reason you're going to bring our names up is to low-key blame us or to low-key dismiss us or low-key suggest that we're privileged in some kind of manner that we're somehow participating in that leaves black women and girls in a worse position, leave black men out of it. I would rather black men write these articles themselves, even if it's on our own blogs and articles, which of course have a lower distribution rate than something like The Guardian. But I'd rather see that happen than to only see our names when it's something egregious that can be used against us. Right? Shout out to Lucas. Appreciate that support. Says the 8 homicides per 100,000 is due to anyone killing a black female or trans woman. The number one killer of black girls is black women. Black women want black men to take accountability for all their deaths. There's a lot of that going on as well. We're going to talk about that. So it continues. The homicide rate among black men in the U.S. has long captured national headlines. See, what they're saying is that black men take up too much of our attention. That's what they mean. Long captured national headlines. This is a low-key dig at black men, what they're regarding as a form of black male privilege. That our deaths are paid attention to. That's what the fuck they consider a privilege. Our deaths get some attention. But if I just told you 200 to 300 black men are killed by police per year, how many of those men get attention? In a given year, maybe 3. And it depends on how egregiously they die. We don't get attention just because we're black men. That's the problem with these kinds of privilege assertions. Well, black men get attention because they're black men, and this is sexist toward black women. That's the low-key argument, right? But that's not what it is. Black men get attention because of how egregious we fucking die. That's what happens. And to regard that as some kind of privilege that you got to dig at black men for, and then shame the journalistic industry, journalism in and of itself, the news industry, to shame the news media industry for, talking about black men that die in egregious ways. This is ridiculous. Whether you're attacking black men directly or indirectly by shaming others that pay attention to dead black men, either way, it's an unnecessary dig at black men. That's what I'm saying. And that shit needs to stop. And that's what they're doing. This is the problem I have with Kimberly Crenshaw's organization, the African American Policy Forum. They're doing the same kind of work. They're trying to foreground women and girls, which is great. Don't have a problem with that. Right? come from a community of Black women and girls. I'm not going to be mad when you talk about the fact, talk about what they're going through. Great, talk about it. But again, this gesture at making it somehow Black men's fault or somehow a privilege that Black women don't get that Black men do get. No, you need to go read some Jim Sedanius. You need to really be understanding what outgroup male treatment is before attacking Black men for something we don't even control. Because again, none of these news industries, none of these corporations do Black men run. When they post our deaths, when they post the videos on how we die, and yes, I will be talking about the brother that got shot over 60 times. Again, it's in the news. Why? Because there was a video and because he died in an egregious fashion that you never hear about. When's the last time you heard of somebody being shot at over 90 times for a traffic violation? Don't worry, I'll wait. You tell me. But this is somehow some kind of privilege that Black men have? Get out of here with that. So, the homicide rate among Black men in the U.S. has long captured national headlines. That's a dig. But despite decades of Black feminist scholarship, there we go, and organizing on the topic, violence against Black women and girls continues to receive little attention. The headlines are Black men and boys face astronomical homicide rates, or Black men and boys face an increase in homicide that's deeply troubling. You might get a paragraph that says, and so are Black women and girls, said Kimberly Crenshaw. I knew she was going to come up in here. A Black feminist legal scholar whose work has highlighted police violence against Black women. Often the data doesn't even get reported. The heightened vulnerability of Black women to violence should be seen and addressed as a crisis alongside the already recognized epidemic of Black male homicide. Now, see, that sounded nice. That means all she's saying there, which sounds so innocent and benign, is that yes, we should recognize Black women and girls alongside Black men. But notice for the last couple paragraphs, there have been these subtle digs at Black men. And then this nice little, a sentence that sounds very innocent, right? As if you haven't been digging at Black men. If you'd have kept that tone throughout the entire article, I wouldn't have a problem. That's not what you're doing, right? That's not what you're doing. And that's not what you've created in this particular culture. So this is the first part, and I may come back to this, but we'll see, because I think there's a couple other things I want us to kind of relate to this. So they're talking about violence against women, and you're right. And what was said earlier in the comment section by Lucas is that they're conflating categories to make the numbers as egregious as possible, and then identifying Black men as the problem, their privilege, making Black men somehow responsible, and shaming anyone else who pays attention so that they can push this narrative, right? But let's kind of pull some of these numbers out, and let's look at a little bit about death. And we're going to start with intimate partner homicide, and we're going to look at some of the data that comes from the National Violent Death Reporting System, NVDRS. Now, the first one I want to show you actually starts with an article I wrote on my blog, newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com, right? And I was actually correcting a previous blog post that I wrote where I was identifying the numbers of homicide, intimate partner homicides in the Black community. And so I kind of wanted to give you this just so you can have some backup, some background to intimate partner homicide, what they used to call domestic violence, but domestic homicide when it comes to someone actually being killed. And so, so you can see this is all coming from the same source. This is all coming from the National Violent Death Reporting System, right? In 2003, you had 57 Black female victims, 22 Black male victims. Right? Now, understand something. This is out of 23.5 million Black females and 21.5 million Black males. The following numbers I'm giving you illustrates the numbers killed according to the Office of Statistics and Programming, National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, CDC, and most particularly the National Violent Death Reporting System, right? So 2003, you see the dynamic. 2004, 97 women, 43 men. 2005, 84 women, 54 men, right? 2006, 81 women, 61 men. 2007, we had a banner year, 104 women, 53 men. 2008, 77 women, 36 men. These are the people who are being killed in the Black community every year. Again, out of 40 plus million Black folk, this is what we're looking at, right? 2009, 48 women, 33 men. 2010, 60 women, 36 men. 63 women and 52 men in 2011. 2012, 80 women, 47 men. Right? I want to be clear because what they start doing is they start playing with the rates. And if you really want to be specific about the rates, let's be clear. Black men, kill black women at higher rates than other men, according to the rates information. But if you really look at it in a way they refuse to do, black women actually kill men to a greater percentage than other groups of women kill their men. And feminists will just tell you it's out of self-defense. And that's a way of dismissing without ever even getting your hands dirty about given situations, right? And so you can see the data there. It's 2014, 77 women, 66 men. I even have a chart up there for the last year. So when I wrote this piece, this was the last year that was available. It was 2015. What you had was 78 men and 94 women who were killed in terms of intimate partner violence. So let's update. Now, the other thing I want you to keep in mind is in terms of the National Violent Death Reporting System, it depends on the number of states that are reporting. So in 2014, for example, there were only 18 states that were reporting. So these numbers were higher, more than likely across the board, but we only had 18 states reporting. Now we have 41 states reporting as of 2018, right? As of 2018, right? And so I know this is going to be hard to see. I'll try to blow it up so some of you who might want to screen capture this can see it. This is 2019. And here again, we got 41 states reporting, which is a pretty good size of number of states. And I think it's going to still go up. Right? And they even list the states that they're supporting, right? From Arkansas to Wyoming, right? And so here you have the number of Black females who were killed by an intimate partner, spouse or intimate partner, right? And it's 252, 12 of whom were pregnant, 67 who were not pregnant within the last year, 31 not pregnant and otherwise specified, and 142 unknown if pregnant, right? But 252 women that died in 2019, according to intimate partner information. Now, the number of men that died is lower, right? And I just chose this. It's actually a long chart. I just chose a portion of it that happened to also mention some information about military participation, but you had 131 men die. So again, this is out of 40 plus million Black folk. You had 252 women, 131 men. Now here's another thing to remember. This doesn't include proxy death, proxy homicide. We've talked about this on my show before. Proxy homicide has to do with usually, and if we're going to break this down by gender, since we're talking about men and women, it's when a woman will call in another man or hire him to assassinate somebody she's upset with, and in this case, a lover or a husband. Now, here's the problem with that. If your wife decides, and often they find this is tied to life insurance, right? But if she decides she wants to have you killed, whether it's for life insurance payout or whether it's because of infidelity or even an accusation of infidelity, right? And she uses either sex, which is something that poorer women use, or money, which is something wealthier women use to pay an assassin, right? They either pay him with sex or they pay him with money to kill a husband or boyfriend, right? If the killer is caught, which is harder to do, especially if it's a professional, but if the killer is caught, it's recorded as a man killing a man, unless they actually find evidence that she initiated the dynamic. But most of the time, if a woman hires an assassin, if it's recorded at all, and if the killer is caught, it's recorded as a man killing a man. See what I mean? So when I say the numbers on, proxy violence are low, it's because it means that they have to actually be caught. And this is why it's important for us to have these conversations, because some of that information is not really available, right? Hit the like button if you will. Again, like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. Support the channel if you will. See the ways to do so on the screen. Patreon, you can become a supporter of the Onyx Report and or the Institute for Black Male Studies, monthly contributor there. You can do it on Cash App, PayPal, Venmo, or right here on YouTube with Super Chat. But support the channel so we can keep this work coming. But my point here is that yes, you're always going to, and this is pretty consistent across race. Usually there are more men recorded killing women than the reverse. Now the rates are what they start to play with. Well, black men kill more black women than any other group of men. Well, black women kill more black men than any other group of women. But we don't talk about that. because black men don't generally respond. We just accept the critique. But I want to add to this that we never include proxy homicide in any of these discussions because there's not really a way to account for it unless the woman is arrested. And a lot of this data is brought about by people who have been arrested for the crime, right? So just to put that into some context, and again, I'm just giving out information on death. Since people want to play with the numbers and play with the rates, I want to give you information so you can make your own decision about how honest people are being. Now, there's a whole nother area that I want to switch to because, again, we're talking about death, but we're going to talk about it from a variety of different vantage points. And we're also going to look at the ways that our own decisions play into death in a manner we don't often talk about. So this is a chart that, and I'm going to provide links for all of this in the description box on the video here on YouTube when I'm done. So you can go look at these yourself. This is from a CDC chart, came out 2020, dealing with maternal mortality rates. And I'll make it as big as I can. I apologize. Every time I screenshot this stuff, I always get my mouse or my cursor right in the middle of the title because I'm not paying attention to that. So I apologize. The table reads number of live births, maternal deaths, and maternal mortality rates by race and Hispanic origin and age. United States, 2018 to 2020. So in other words, what it's looking at are the number of, live births and deaths of, mothers, right, who are giving birth. And then they also look at the mortality rate. Now, what I want to show you in this is something that saddened me, especially as a widower. I've not only, lost a wife, I've lost a child. I would have actually this year, I would have a 22-year-old daughter, but she died in the womb and still had to be delivered. So, and my wife's life was on the edge of a knife for a number of days. So maternal mortality, yeah, that hits close to home. I've lost a baby. I've damn near lost my wife to that. Actually, it still technically happened. When my wife passed in 2009, we were pregnant. We lost the baby, but her body never recovered. So this is still a fact. It was still a factor related to pregnancy even then. But anyway, so what I have on the screen right now is an image of the chart that's covering Black women for a couple of different years. And I had to split it up this way just to get it on the screen. So again, this is 2018, 2019, and 2020. And what it says here is there are 206 Black women that died in in 2018, right? 241 died in 2019. 293 died in 2020, right? Now these numbers were higher than any other group. It is true, Black women die due to maternal mortality higher than any other group. But here's something in particular I thought interesting. When you look at this bottom row that I've highlighted, it says 40 and over, right? It says 40 and over, right? So that means, and they give you the numbers of women that died. But what's more important is if you look at the mortality rate. So it means that 239.9%, right? That's the rate of Black women who died over 40 having babies in 2018. 2019, the rate went down to 166.5. But in 2020, the rate went to 263.1%. 263.1% was the mortality rate of women, Black women over 40 trying to have babies. Now, why do I bring that up? Because this is something we've been talking about, especially online for the last couple of years, and the Black community in particular. Shout out to Akin. Shout out to Killer the Game. Appreciate the support. Ken says I begun years ago to withdraw my money. All right, so yeah, these people are using any means they can to advertise what they're doing, whatever. They've been hitting my comment sections with all of this mess, and now they're donating, I guess. But hey, you can read it, check it out. Wait a minute. All right. Anyway, you can read that yourself if you want to. But I point this out because as we talk about this culture in the Black community, where we, in particular, train Black girls from really infancy to develop a career, right? Focus on her life, have it all, right? But focus on career and education first, which usually for the average woman kind of means that the 20s are filled with a focus on work. And maybe sometime in the 30s, there might be a temporary kind of gesture toward relationship slash marriage. And of course, that's also when you have complaints of not enough men being available. But we don't look at it from men's perspective. We just look at it from women's perspective, right? But from a man's perspective, you have no experience with interacting with men. You don't know how to. You decide that they're important in your 30s, especially if you've already had a few kids. And when they don't conform to your agenda, something in the 90s I used to call insert man here, when they don't, fall into your agenda, the problem is the men. No, the problem is men weren't a priority until the culture told you that you were supposed to focus on them. And that generally meant after your career and your education and the few kids you already had along the way, because we're going to pretend like women don't also have a biological imperative to reproduce the way men do. We want to reproduce. Sex is our drive to do that. When women want to reproduce, they seduce you. And all of a sudden, that birth control that's no longer in use, somehow you don't always get told that it's not in use. She might even tell you can hit it raw. All that good stuff happens, and yet you get a pregnancy out of that. And it was funny because Kevin would confront many a woman and ask her, well, why did you have a baby with a dude that you couldn't marry? Now, I'm not going down the whole marriage line per se, but what I found interesting was the responses women gave. Well, I was just young. What she's actually saying was it wasn't important about him. He wasn't the focal point. It wasn't about having a relationship. It wasn't about being married. It was about I wanted a baby. That was that biological push to reproduce at all costs. But we're going to get rid of relationships and marriage because the focal point is her career. Well, that culture has continued to push reproductive options for women to later and later ages. And in the Black community, that's pushed even further. Now, I'm not going to argue that's the only thing pushing this, but you can't underestimate the importance of a culture that tells women to wait later and later, especially if it promotes the idea that you can have a baby at any age. Well, what's the cost of having a baby at any age? Well, in 2020, the cost was a mortality rate for Black mothers over 40 that was 263%. Now, just to be clear, mortality rate for white women in 2020 was 96.8. Mortality rate for Hispanic women was 86. I put in some context for you. This culture of telling women to wait because technology somehow means that any woman of any age can have a baby. Because you saw Janet Jackson have one at 50 or whatever she was, that this is somehow now normalized. No. You saw a celebrity who had millions at her disposal, and at the time, a billionaire husband, if I remember correctly. That's what you saw. That's not the case for the average woman. And so in essence, we have women dying trying to live out a culture that doesn't fucking work for this. Absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. Shout out to Donnie. He says, has anyone researched the correlation between Black maternal mortality and Black female physiological health? Can't say. But if you got an answer to that question, put it in the comment section. Right. All right. So this is what we're looking at. The actual mortality rates for Black women are through the roof. And the reason I raise that is because we can actually have a conversation about that. But the aspect of it that we leave out of the discussion are the choices that we make in the culture we produce. And we don't talk about the impact that that has, not only on the women that die on the operating table trying to give birth and the babies that might pass away at the same time, but even in terms of the boyfriends and husbands who, have to lose out. And I'm telling you, I've been in a situation where I wanted a baby. When I lost my daughter, I was broken behind that. I still got her picture up behind me. Well, not picture, but anyway. So, people act like this stuff doesn't affect men, but it does. But at some point, if we're going to talk about death, then let's talk about death. Let's talk about the ways we contribute to that death. And let's talk about the ways we ignore aspects of the death discussion that need to be talked about, like proxy homicide in terms of intimate partner homicide and how that affects men. It lowers our numbers, or it should say it lowers the number of Black female aggressors because they've hired men, right? And then when it comes to mortality, what are the ways that we participate? But I'm going to go to another area, and I've already done a whole show about this, and it deals with child maltreatment. This is coming out of the Child Maltreatment 2020 study. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because if we're going to talk about Black death, there's something I think we need to take into account. Black folks are human beings. And what tends to happen with human beings when you get to the macro numbers is that people tend to violate the most vulnerable. It is what it is. Men, yeah, can violate women because physically, generally speaking, they're more vulnerable. Black men, however, are also vulnerable, but in a different way. We're vulnerable in regard to law enforcement. We're vulnerable in regard to our treatment in society. So I think part of the reason that our numbers tend to be higher, even in terms of the homicide rates by women in intimate partner relationships, is because Black men suffer a vulnerability that other men don't suffer, except for maybe American Indian men to some extent. Meaning that if you accuse a Black man of abusing you, of hurting you, people are going to tend to believe it, even if it's untrue, to a greater degree than any other demographic of men. Black men's vulnerabilities makes you accessible to abuse. So what I mean by that is human beings tend to violate the most vulnerable. Now I bring that up because again, we're talking about Black death. So let's talk about Black death. In terms of the child maltreatment report. Now, again, I did a whole show on this. So if you want to look at that, go ahead and check that out. If I remember, I'll try and put the link in the description. If I forget to do it, go ahead and ask me to do so in the comment section. I'll go ahead and find it and pull it up for you to watch. But just a couple of bullets that I thought were interesting that you might want to know about, right? Most perpetrators of child maltreatment, this usually has to do with homicide, right? The killing of children. Most perpetrators were between 18 and 44. They were a parent. Now, this is how they do this. They break this up into categories. So you got to look at how the categories intersect so you can figure out who's actually killing kids to the greatest degree and how, right? So they're 18 to 44. They're a parent. So it's not a babysitter. It's not a child facility. It's not a teacher at the school. It's a parent, right? It's a female parent, right? So we're generally talking about mothers more than anything, right? The white and Black dynamic, I'll go into more detail in a second. And the infants that tend to die tend to be less than a year old. And the primary way they die is due to neglect. The secondary way they die is due to physical abuse. The majority of the kids that die, particularly in the Black community, are boys. How about that? In 2020, it was 504 Black boys. It was 560 white boys. Now, understand, the Black community is only about 12, 13% of society. So when our numbers almost rival the white community, that's a big deal. That's a big deal, right? It continues in the second paragraph. Nearly 90%, 88.1% of child fatalities are one of three races: white at 38.7%, African American at 34.9%, or Hispanic at 14.5%. Using the number of victims and the population data to create rates highlights some racial disparity. The rate of African American child fatalities, 5.9 per 100,000 African American children, is 3.1 times greater than the rate of white child fatalities, 1.9 per 100,000 white children, and 3.6 times greater than the rate of Hispanic child fatalities at 1.65 per 100,000. So again, even though the numbers of white children that are killed are higher, the rates for the Black community, even though the official rate is slightly lower because of the numbers in the community, the rates are actually higher. So again, what we tend to find are that boys are the ones that suffer the most when it comes to neglect, when it comes to child fatality, and it tends to be the female parent that kills the most between 18 and 44 years old. And the two primary ways that they die are neglect and physical abuse. I wonder if Kimberly Crenshaw or The Guardian is going to talk about that. No? Not even in the sense of trying to attack women, but in the sense of identifying Black boys as more vulnerable than any other group of kids to child fatality. See, I told y'all earlier, the only reason we talk about Black male death is because of how egregious we die. or how egregious the circumstances we find ourselves in. Right? So here you find that you have a preponderance of Black male children that basically die due to neglect and abuse. But that's not egregious enough. So it doesn't make the news. But if Black boys were privileged simply because we have penises, then this would be splashed over articles left and right. How many articles have y'all run across in mainstream culture that talk about the vulnerability of Black boys to child fatality? Again, don't worry. I'll wait. I thought we were privileged, right? Where's the articles talking about that? Black men don't even talk about that, let alone anybody else. Because when we talk about boys, when we talk about men, yeah, sometimes it gets attention if it's egregious enough, but it's really a kind of fetishized kind of attention. It's not an attention that's actually rooted in empathy. It's often an attention that's rooted in a desire to see Black men violated and killed in some kind of strange way. And then politically, on the other end, you do have grassroots folk who are doing good work to try and bring attention to injustice. And then you've got parasites that will use the deaths of Black men to further their agenda and bait and switch the conversation as soon as they get your attention to anything other than Black men themselves, especially heterosexual Black men or boys. And this is what we're dealing with. So I bring up child fatality because if you're going to talk about death in the Black community, then let's talk about death. And why don't we talk about that? It's not egregious enough. It's not interesting enough. Okay. Shout out to Queen Kalila. Hope you're good. Good to see you in here. Brother Dardar, what's going on? Right. Better You says, great discussion. Do you feel media depiction of Black men's death desensitizes the general public and even us to violence perpetrated against us? Absolutely. It desensitizes us from having any empathy. But the titillation involved with seeing Black men die in egregious ways, that's never desensitized. That's still apparent. That's still something people want to see. But that's not the same thing as empathy. So those things are not the same. We'll go to the last category I want to talk about today in terms of death. And this is really the full list, right? And this is something I want to share. I'm going to blow it up again so you can screenshot it if you need to. Right? This is also coming from National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Right? And so this data is looking at top 10 causes of death for Black females between 1999 and 2014. So we're going to talk about death. Let's fucking talk about death. Okay, this is the real. Now you can see on this chart, right, that they have death, the actual numbers between 1999 and 2014 of people who have died at every age group, and they have it ranked by severity in terms of the numbers of people that have died. And then they list it by age, but then they show you what the categories are for those deaths. You can screenshot this, and you could literally write papers on this endlessly. So obviously, we're not going to have time to go through all of it, but you can look at the deaths of Black females here under the age of 1 all the way up to over 85 years old. Right? And one of the things I want to call your attention to is the number one killer of Black folk is heart disease. Don't let anybody bullshit you and tell you it's Black men, it's abuse. I showed you the numbers on homicide, intimate partner homicide, right? You're talking about a couple hundred people, male and female together, per year. But, when it comes to heart disease, that is the number one killer of Black females and Black males. But I want to highlight something here. These numbers change. So if you look up to the far right in the top square where it says all ages, so this is when they combine all ages and just look at the highest numbers of death, what you find is that for Black women, there are 585,000 deaths due to heart disease, right? When you go to Black males, same time period, 1999 to 2014, 574,000 deaths due to heart disease, right? 585 Black women, 585,000 Black women, 574,000 Black men. This was up to 2014, right? So what we're looking at here is, one category. We're just talking about the number one killer of Black folk. Up until 2014, this was something that actually Black women experienced worse than any other group. I want to show you something. This is now looking at 1999 to 2020. 1999 to 2020. This is Black females. There have been 822,000 Black women who've died due to heart disease. And you can see the list underneath that in terms of the top 10 causes of death. And notice you will not see intimate partner homicide in this list at all. Heart disease, malignant neoplasms or cancer, cerebral vascular disease, diabetes, unintentional injury, nephritis, chronic low respiratory disease, Alzheimer's, septicemia, hypertension. Those are the top 10 causes of Black female death in the United States from 1999 to 2020. I want you to remember that number, 822,000 women who have died due to heart disease. Let's look at the men, 843,000. In other words, just in the last few years, in the last 8 years or so, we've actually seen Black men surpass Black women in terms of heart disease. And the top 10 list is slightly different, right? You still have malignant neoplasms and unintentional injuries, cerebral vascular disease. But notice, well, one, unintentional injuries is higher for Black men than it is for Black women. And the main reason for that is that basically, and I would attribute a lot of that to employment, to workplace deaths, engagements, behavior. You're talking about unintentional injury. Men in general across race tend to, work jobs that are a little more risky. And that's not even limited to the top 10, death-oriented fields from police to military, right? But you have a higher number of unintentional deaths when it comes to men, and that's pretty standard across race. But homicide makes the top 10 list for Black men. Over 165,000 Black men have died due to homicide between 1999 and 2020. Homicide is not even in the top 10 for women, right? So that's one of the major differences. If you notice at the bottom, second to bottom last square on the right, HIV. Black men, especially men who have sex with men, tend to have extremely high HIV rates. And this is in 2022. We're still dealing with these issues. Well, this chart is dealing with 2020, but I'm saying HIV deaths, you'll find Black men are still highly vulnerable to. Again, looking at Black men, you don't see HIV in the top 10 causes of death at all, right? But they do have higher numbers of, we have more malignant neoplasms than they do. But in terms of cerebral vascular disease, they have higher numbers of women that die due to that. Diabetes, 137,000 Black men. Diabetes, 158,000 Black women. So Black women are dying more due to, diabetes than Black men are. Chronic low respiratory disease, 106,000 Black men. 96,000. So Black men are dying to chronic low respiratory disease to a greater extent than Black women. My point in bringing these charts up is that when you really want to talk about death, then let's just look at the numbers and stop fucking around and dancing around with the rates. Just stop trying to incriminate Black men for your own political advancement. Let's just look at the numbers. And the reality is we die to a greater extent due to different things. And that these things change at regular intervals, month to month, year to year, the numbers change. But if you step back and look at the macro picture, we die due to different things to different degrees. And sometimes those degrees change. Like I said, heart disease used to be higher among Black women. Black men surpassed that. But in other areas, still not so much. It all depends on what we're looking at. But if you want to actually have a real conversation about Black death, and we do need to qualify this. I mean, I had a whole show or series of shows where I talked about death in terms of gender. Shout out to Electrician 480. Appreciate the support. What's up, Winston? Good to see you. Artisan, man. Good to see you, man. Ain't seen you in a minute. If I have the health to do it, I might go see Thor, but I don't want to get sick again. So, and I mean that in terms of sitting in the movie theater and in terms of the content on the screen, by the way. But anyway, point I'm getting at is that when you want to talk about and have a real conversation about Black death, and you want to look at it in terms of gender, you can't make Black men responsible because you want to politically advance yourself. You can't low-key accuse Black men of some type of death-oriented privilege because it gets you more attention, while it downplays what boys and men are dealing with. And if you really want to look at the accuracy of this stuff, And you got to move beyond these tropes about black male boogeymen and actually get to the realities of Black death. And what you find, as is consistent with Sedanius's notion of outgroup males, is on the metrics that seem to grab our attention to the greatest degree, you're going to tend to find that men die due to them at a higher rate than others. But one of the areas that women have always been able to corner in terms of securing attention has been issues related to reproduction or issues related to intimate partner homicide. But again, that's if we don't go through the weeds because there's some unanswered questions. So, proxy homicide, that's really a game changer, but there's no way to verify it. So, women double down on that as a way of politically advancing themselves and sometimes just calling attention to a much needed issue. But what we don't understand is that in terms of the data, abuse tends to be bidirectional. Homicide doesn't tend to be as extreme as people think. And Black men find themselves extremely vulnerable to both. And I talked about a study that came out a number of years ago, did a show about that as well, that actually showed, according to over 20 to 30 different reports from the 1980s to the 2000s, I think it came all the way up to 2015, when they actually did a meta study of a variety of studies dealing with abuse and homicide related to race and, of course, gender. From the 1980s to now, what they found was that Black men were actually the most vulnerable group across race and across demographic. Because our vulnerability as outgroup males is not limited to our physicality. It's limited to our social standing in society and our treatment, most particularly by law enforcement. And it means that those things can be weaponized against us. Used to be a time where a white woman could accuse you as a Black man of having done something to her simply because you were there. She had the power to do it. And usually when you give human beings power, at some point they abuse it. There were plenty of white women that abused that power simply because they could. But now we live in an era, especially post 1970s, 1980s, where we see similar treatment of Black men by Black women. And when you add in this political coup that's been taking place since especially the 1980s, that's foregrounding Black women and girls at the expense of Black men and boys, you see a whole nother dimension to this, where the same mechanisms that white women used to use are now being used by some Black women. And we're afraid to call it out as Black men because many of us are raised by women. We don't learn how to actually see women and hold them accountable. Hell, we don't even do it as a society. We don't even literally have the physical prisons built to treat women the way we treat men in terms of criminal sentencing and so on and so forth. We physically don't have the prisons. So as a society, we don't hold women accountable. We don't know how to. But in the Black community, there's a distinct history as to why we don't, especially since Generation X. Most of us are raised by women at rates over 70% in terms of children being born to single parents. Only about 4% are male single parents. Somewhere between 2 and 4%. Majority raised by women. We don't know how to hold women accountable. And this is why it's such a huge issue for Black men to start doing so now. Some of us have untapped rage because we're finally learning the vocabulary to point out what's been happening to us that in a manner we've never been allowed to do before. Others of us refuse to accept that it happens altogether. And you'll get cussed out in some circles just for bringing it up. Because again, we've not been socialized to hold women to the same level of accountability we hold men. So I know it seems like today might have been a little all over the place, but it's actually not. What I'm talking to you about is I'm trying to give you some accurate information about the use of Black death to advance a feminist agenda that tends to work to the detriment of Black men and boys. And I want to give you some raw information, not just in terms of rates, but also in terms of raw numbers, and throw in a few issues so you can make your own decision, or you can have the information available at your fingertips to push back against faulty arguments that are misandrous in orientation and designed to undermine Black men and boys specifically because it advances them. And there are a variety of groups that do it. Dr. Curry has pointed out, going back to the 19th century, the way white women's movements were predicated off of manipulating and not just downplaying, but turning Black men into monsters. Their whole feminism in and of itself really does begin in this country in particular in response to Black men. The very possibility of Black men being able to vote helped galvanize white women. And they used the same logic to appeal to Black women to support their agenda, this false agenda of a sisterhood across race. But they use the same logic of making black men the boogeymen to inspire this. And it worked. And it's still working to this day. Because the Guardian article I started this video with is basically a white woman's gesture of attacking men to foreground herself. You have many of these black feminists that have taken that same gesture, that same, format, and used it in the black community because it gains them traction, especially with white liberal feminists. To use black men as the boogeymen that white women use white men for. But don't get it twisted. White women started that mess on black men first. And too many black women have participated in doing the same thing to black men. And I'm calling attention to it because we don't have a language for how to call attention to it. Too many of us grew up in circles where we heard this shit, we saw this shit from household conversations during Thanksgiving to sitting in a classroom in college, and we didn't know how to respond. Because the low-key response was, if you were critical of this new black women's voice that you started to hear in the late 1970s, that you were inherently a sexist. But when they downplayed and made derogatory black men and boys, you knew something was wrong, but you didn't know how to say it. And even when you said it, and even if you put it together in a way that people could understand, you were deemed the problem. And so now I'm seeing men come together and challenge this. And I'm trying to add to that discussion and give you some arrows to put in your quiver so you can use to make sense of what's going on and to challenge bullshit that unfairly castigates black men as something other than human. So shout out to y'all. I appreciate y'all's patience. And again, I appreciate all the support that you guys have given in the last couple of weeks. My voice is still messing with me, so I'm going to pull out from here, but I look forward to hearing your comments or reading your comments, and I look forward to being able to go back through the live comments. And I apologize if I missed anything. Shout out to Kente for the Cash App. Appreciate that support. Y'all continue to support the channel, because sometimes when you see, a content creator that disappears for a while, they're going through something. But it's amazing to see how quickly the support dries up. We got to do better at supporting each other. But I myself, as an individual, want to thank my subscribers, my supporters for the ongoing support y'all gave in the midst of all the stuff I was going through. I greatly appreciate it. So let's continue to support each other as a community. And I wish y'all the best. Y'all have a good one. Peace.